Hey everybody, it is Wednesday, October 16th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Nunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, we're now officially less than 3 weeks until Election Day.
It's unbelievable because I feel like we've been talking about this election for 2 years, literally.
Yes.
But early voting is already underway, as we're going to talk about. But in a key swing state, people are already voting.
Yeah, it's you still can register in about half the country through Election Day. In many cases, if you're not registered to vote, the deadline has passed in your state. So please get out there and register if you still can. And in a number of states now, you can early vote. So you don't have to bet it all on Election Day, depending on the health of your family, the weather, traffic, etc. Get out there and cast your ballot.
Okay, let's get to some news here, starting with politics. As we were just mentioning, early voting has begun in Georgia with a historic turnout on the first day. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris rolls out some new policies trying to shore up her standing with Black men voters. And a Donald Trump town hall took a musical turn. To the Middle East, the U.S. issues a stark warning to Israel and what we are learning about Israel's plan for a counterstrike on Iran. To business news, 7-Eleven will close hundreds of locations. Its plans to turn things around.
And a major announcement by Walgreens and the number of pharmacies they plan to close across the country.
What forecasters expect from this coming winter, why it could be a rainy Christmas in the northern part of the country. And Prague, the latest European city to tell tourists to leave it alone. Moshe, they're not interested.
Europe is over us. They're over the tourists.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, a big day for, I think, one of the best musical albums in history. Two sides and hits on both sides. Back when kids, back in the day with records, there were A-side and B-side.
Okay, I'm anxious to hear what you think is one of the best records in history. I have some ideas.
It's not just me, it's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They agree with me.
It isn't music, according to Moshe.
I mean, listen, sometimes I disagree with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and sometimes we agree. And this is a case where we agree.
Okay, let's start with politics. Even though Election Day, about 3 weeks away, voting has already started in the important swing state of Georgia, where the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, says that voters set a record-breaking pace for early voting on Tuesday, with about 250,000 people turning out to vote. There was video showing people just lined up outside of polling places waiting to cast their ballots. And it comes a day after a Georgia judge ruled that county election officials may not delay or decline certifying election results over allegations of fraud in the state. The judge ruled on Monday that the certification of election results is, quote, mandatory. There have been concerns that rogue election officials could try to delay or even decline to certify results after Election Day amid possible allegations of fraud or error. Over the summer, the Republican-controlled state election board had passed a rule that requires all ballots be hand-counted on election night. That prompted legal challenges and pushback from both major parties as officials warned about potential delays in reporting results. There are now hearings scheduled for this week about those lawsuits challenging the new rules.
This is a big deal, Jill, especially for those of you who think we're going to get a result on the night of November 5th. Godspeed to all of you, especially if the Georgia rule goes into effect here and they have to hand count a couple million ballots in addition to machine counting them. This is an issue in a number of other states and could mean that we don't know who the winner is for a week or two.
Speaking of Georgia, Donald Trump was in Atlanta Tuesday. So he won Georgia in 2016 by about 5 percentage points, which is a pretty comfortable margin, but only by a fraction of a percent, so just under 12,000 votes. And if you remember, Trump and his allies falsely claimed that Georgia's election was tainted by voter fraud. Trump was later indicted for his attempt to overturn the election. A trial about that could take place next year. This time around, polls show that Georgia could really go either way. I also want to mention another swing state, North Carolina, where early voting starts tomorrow.
Yeah, both campaigns putting a lot of hope in winning those states. It'll be very tough for Trump to win the election without winning Georgia. And Kamala Harris is really looking at Georgia as an insurance policy if she's not able to keep what they call the blue wall of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In particular, they're looking at the suburban vote there. They're looking at the black vote there. And Trump is looking to revive, and Trump is looking to really restore Georgia as a red state. It's going to be very closely watched here. It's going to be very closely watched, as is North Carolina. And the early voting may tell us some things in the days ahead here. One thing to keep in mind is that Trump has sworn off early voting. At least he did in 2020. He called it corrupt, suggested folks shouldn't even bother. This go around, people around him have said, Mr. Trump, you need to get people out there early voting if we're going to win this election. So this go around, despite what he said 4 years ago, Trump has embraced early voting. He's calling on people to early vote. And so that's notable here. Earlier in the day, Trump was in Chicago, speaking at the Economic Club there. He did an interview with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, John Micklethwaite, on all things economy. It was a fascinating conversation, Jill. He challenged Trump again and again on his economic policies, since there's a number of economists who are very concerned about the economic impact of various things Trump is calling for in the next term. Both Trump and Harris's policies are set to run up the deficit by trillions of dollars. Trump more significant than Harris, according to economists at Goldman Sachs and other banks. And it's interesting, Jill, because a lot of finance people are into Trump, but officially, economically speaking, on paper, Trump's policies concern them more in terms of inflation and other impact there. And that's what really made yesterday's conversation interesting, because one issue that really took center stage was tariffs. We've told you about this, especially if you have been a part of our election survival series over on Mo News Premium. Trump calls himself the tariff man. He's talked about 100% tariffs, 200% tariffs, 500% tariffs. Yesterday, Jill, he threw out a 2,000% tariff, and it has economists worried about the impact that'll have on tens of millions of jobs here in the U.S. that are dependent on trade, as well as consumers. Because tariffs, while they're effectively taxes on products made abroad, who pays those prices? Consumers here. And ultimately, we don't make everything here. And even if you turn on those tariffs, it might take years, if ever, for those products to eventually be made here in the U.S. And in the interim, the concern is that that'll cost American consumers. It'll effectively be a tax on American consumers. And so you heard the editor of Bloomberg challenge Trump on that multiple times. Trump maintained the threat here. And really what he's arguing is he's like, I'm not even talking about tariffs. I'm talking about the threat of tariffs. Remember, Trump is a negotiator here. He wrote Art of the Deal decades ago. And so for him, when he throws out 2,000%, 500%, 200%, which are, really remarkable, extreme tariffs that we have never seen, Trump says it's a negotiating tactic. Ultimately, if I throw that out there, you think that factory is going to move abroad? You think China's going to, try to send us certain products, or Mexico's going to send us certain products? And so he tried to argue here it's a negotiation tactic. Here's a bit of the back and forth between John Micklethwaite of Bloomberg News, a longtime economics reporter there, a longtime economics editor and reporter there, and Donald Trump yesterday in Chicago.
The world. That is going to have a serious effect on the overall economy. And yes, you're going to find some people who will gain from individual tariffs. The overall effect could be massive in terms of the economy.
I agree it's going to have a massive effect, positive effect. It's going to be a positive, not a negative.
Well,
let me just tell you. I know how committed you are to this, and it must be hard for you to, spend 25 years talking about tariffs as being negative, and then have somebody explain to you that you're totally wrong. It'll have a negative. It will have. I'll go a step further. If you don't do this, this country has no chance.
40 million jobs is a lot of jobs to rely on trade.
They're all coming back.
Those are 40 million jobs. Those are 40 million jobs in America that rely on trade.
Are you ready? John Deere, great company. They announced about a year ago they're going to build big plants outside of the United States, right? They're going to build them in Mexico.
And you threatened them with tariffs and they stopped.
That's right. I said, if John Deere builds those plants and not selling anything into the United States, they just announced yesterday they're probably not going to build the plants, okay?
So this is the big debate, Jill. When people ask, what would the next Trump term look like? The question is, how far will he go? A reminder, tariffs you don't need Congress to be involved in them. They can be put out unilaterally by the White House. And keep in mind, with tariffs, some of the money the government will make off those tariffs, off those taxes, the government already in the first Trump term had to then pay farmers and people here economically impacted by the tariff. So philosophically speaking, Republicans and Democrats have been against tariffs for decades. That's a bit of what you heard from Micklethwaite. That's what you heard the pushback from Trump being like, it sucks to know that you're wrong about this, huh? That you've been wrong about this for 25 years, because that's Trump's argument. That tariffs are a solution here, a negotiating tactic. He likes the idea of them. He likes using the threat of them. And so it'll make for, an unpredictable 4 years should he win.
Both candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, are going on a media blitz in the final weeks of the campaign. So Trump did that interview with Bloomberg News and the Economic Club of Chicago on Tuesday, and a pre-taped town hall with Fox that will air today. Harris Faulkner is moderating it, and it will be all women in the audience. As for Fox, Kamala Harris is doing an interview with Bret Baier today. It is a big deal that she is doing Fox. It comes after Tim Walz has done Fox News Sunday the last couple of weekends. So it's a full court press here for them to try to reach independent voters along with their base. Speaking of reaching independent men who don't vote, both campaigns are talking about doing Joe Rogan, which is the biggest podcast in the world, 14 million listeners an episode on Spotify, and another 30 million between YouTube and Instagram.
Jill, the Joe Rogan podcast might be like what the Meet the Press interview was back in the Tim Russert days. That's where we're at. Those numbers are like insane. 14 million on Spotify. We don't even know the Apple numbers, but we're probably talking about double that when you include Apple podcast numbers, and then another 30 million on YouTube and Instagram. Joe Rogan, interesting when it comes to his politics, has not necessarily been a big Trumper. Has been critical of Trump, but has also been very critical of Kamala Harris. So very interesting if both campaigns end up doing Joe Rogan. If you've ever listened to that podcast, it lasts a couple hours and could make for some interesting conversations with both of them.
Yeah, this could be the first real presidential campaign that we're seeing the candidates take the alternative media a lot more seriously. Kamala Harris, we know, sat down for the Call Her Daddy podcast, and the number one podcast, I believe, on Spotify for women.
For women. Yeah. So it's the number 2 podcast overall in the world, and then Joe is number 1.
And as we have talked about previously on this podcast, Harris's campaign is trying to make this big push to get Black men voters. Earlier this week, she rolled out Opportunity Agenda. It's a new economic plan aimed directly at Black men, which includes 1 million loans that would forgive up to $20,000 to start a business. It supports federal marijuana legalization, some new federal rules to protect cryptocurrency assets, which more than 20% of Black Americans own or have owned. It calls for creating more mentorship and apprenticeship programs, investing in research on health issues that disproportionately affect Black people, like sickle cell, diabetes, and prostate cancer.
Yeah, and as part of that, as we talk about alternate media, she's been really making a big push in Black media. She did an interview in recent days with Roland Martin. She also appeared with Charlamagne the God of The Breakfast Club, who's also been very critical of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at times, and was in particular and was critical in particular of Barack Obama last week. We told you about how Obama in Monday's podcast spoke directly to Black men, saying, why aren't you supporting a Black woman? And made it at times an appeal based on race, and saying, you need to help someone from your community out. Charlamagne, who is incredibly influential, didn't like that tone at all, saying, no, we have an issue with Harris and Walz because we don't know what they stand for. It's not about race. It's not about Kamala Harris being a woman. This is not misogyny here. So an interesting discussion happening in the community right now. Jill, it sort of reminds me of when Trump recently told the Jewish community that if I lose, it's on you. That's sort of how the Black community now feels from the Harris campaign, being like, wait, if you lose, it's on us because you depend on 90% Black vote. And if you get 80%, you lose. You might have an issue as a business, so to speak, as a campaign. If you're dependent on 90% of the Black vote in order to win an election, you need to diversify, so to speak, your appeal. your voter appeal there. So a lot of interesting conversation happening right now. Speaking of that Charlemagne the God conversation, he is known of asking very blunt questions of celebrities. Here's him speaking to Harris about the border.
Doesn't the Biden administration have to take some blame for the border, though? A lot of the blame? Because, I mean, the first 3 years, y'all did get a lot of things wrong with the border.
No, Charlemagne, within hours of being inaugurated, the first bill we passed before we did the Inflation Reduction Act, before we did the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, before we did the Safer Communities Act to deal with gun violence, first thing we dropped was a bill to fix the broken immigration system.
He also asked about issues directly related to the community, including how she would curb police brutality. She says that she would work to pass the George Floyd Policing Act, which stalled in Congress back in 2021. Jill, I'm going to be closely watching today those Fox interviews. I think it's so interesting that she has chosen, with less than 3 weeks left, to do Fox. Some of the platforms we mentioned, not a surprise. Fox, the fact that she's doing Brett Baier, looking to appeal to independents, and we know who the Fox audience is. It's mainly conservatives, but some independents or independent-minded Democrats. How she handles that interview, I think, is going to be fascinating.
And what he asks her is going to be really fascinating as well.
It's definitely going to be very different from the interview she did with Dana Bash on CNN and Stephanie Ruhle over on MSNBC.
Okay, speaking of Trump, he was holding a town hall campaign event in suburban Philadelphia Monday night, and it turned into kind of like an impromptu music festival. So he was doing a Q&A with the audience. They got about 4 questions in when 2 people in the crowd fainted from the heat. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem was moderating. And at that point, Trump just stopped the questions and said, all right, let's listen to music.
Let's not do any more questions. Let's just listen to music. Let's make it into our music. Who the hell wants to hear questions, right? Let me hear that music, please.
Everyone, let's thank President Trump.
Nice and loud.
God bless you. Let's send President Trump back to the White House.
Nobody's leaving. What's going on? There's nobody leaving. Keep going. Keep going. Should we keep going? All right, turn that music up. Turn it up. Great song.
So for the next 30, 45 minutes, Amos, Trump, and Noem stood on the stage, occasionally dancing to various songs.
You say dancing, you say swaying. Sometimes he moved his arm. Sometimes he just stood. Sometimes he talked to people around. Jill, it was very different. I've covered campaign rallies going back 20 years now, multiple presidential elections. I have never seen anything like this. Apparently, it was too hot in the room. A couple of people fainted. So instead of just releasing everyone or continuing the conversation, he's like, let's just all stand around and listen to music now. Some people asked, like, so did that make the room cooler? Not necessarily temperature-wise, but people in the room loved it. If you talk to the people who went to the rally, they stood outside all day to get into the rally. He took 4 questions, and then they just listened to Ave Maria by Pavarotti, It's a Man's World by James Brown, Time to Say Goodbye by Sarah Brightman, YMCA by the Village People, Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor, Hallelujah by Rufus Wainwright, November Rain by Guns N' Roses, Memory from the musical Cats by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Jill, an eclectic musical mix.
Doesn't former President Obama put out a playlist every year?
He does on Spotify.
Like
he puts out his favorite songs of the year.
So this would be Trump's playlist, I guess.
This is what he does at Mar-a-Lago. So if you talk to people who go to Mar-a-Lago, he DJs off of an iPad at Mar-a-Lago. And like he has his favorites. In YMCA, he loves it. Hallelujah, he loves it. November Rain, he's a big fan of. He likes Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals. But Andrew Lloyd Webber, unfortunately for him, does not like Donald Trump. So that's made for a difficult relationship there. Either way, it was just very different. I got a lot of notes about it, Jill, on Instagram. Some people, some Trump supporters being like, why are you making a thing out of this? You're biased. I'm like, with all due respect to all of you, if Kamala Harris did a town hall meeting where she was expected to take questions and then 4 questions then stopped it and listened to music on stage, occasionally swaying for 45 minutes, I would definitely report that as well. So, I think that it just speaks to Trump as a character. And this is what he does. Democrats have said this is a sign that he's starting to lose it. They're trying to make a point saying, that cognitively he's not all there. I didn't see signs of that. And I watched the full 45 minutes, Jill, as we cut a mashup for the Instagram account. Still interesting. And again, I don't know that I would, as a DJ, flow like Time to Say Goodbye into YMCA into Nothing Compares to You. But, I'm not going to Trump, this is how he DJs at Mar-a-Lago, and this is how he DJ'd at his rally in Pennsylvania.
So Terry Moran from ABC News was at the rally, and he was doing a report on it, and he said that it came off, I think, weirder on TV than it did for the people who were actually in the room. And he said he's like, they were loving it, actually. That some people left, but other people were really into it. And that it felt like this intimate thing, and that Trump was walking around shaking people's hands. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Trump knows his audiences. For these people, they're hanging out. They spent all day in line waiting to see this guy. They're a big fan of him. Like if you attend a campaign rally, you're typically not an undecided voter. If you have to stand in line for 10 hours, you're probably a big fan of the the candidate you're seeing. And so for them, they're just like, oh, he's playing his favorite songs, and I'm in a small room with him, and this is unique.
Let's dance.
Though notably for YMCA, he didn't do the YMCA. He didn't put his hands in the air and do the YMCA. Which
Kristi Noem was trying to get it going, though.
She was, and then there were these interesting moments where Trump starts to do hand gestures and moves, and then Kristi Noem tries to mimic them, and then Trump stops, and then Noem looks over and she's like, "Oh, I guess we're not doing that anymore." So it was definitely awkward for some of the people around him. I think Trump was very comfortable, though.
All right, time for the speed read. Let's start in the Middle East. From the Washington Post, the U.S. is warning Israel that it will withhold arms unless aid to Gaza starts flowing. The Biden administration has set a 30-day deadline for Israel to improve Palestinians' access to food, medicine, and other necessities. In an October 13th letter to senior Israeli officials, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken demanded urgent steps to ensure that non-combatants have access to food and other necessities, blaming lawlessness and actions by the Israeli government for a recent deterioration of conditions in Gaza. The letter gives the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu 1 month to comply, which would delay any action until after the U.S. presidential election. So it doesn't explicitly reference a possible suspension of arms transfers, but it does represent an implicit warning that the U.S. could curtail or halt those shipments.
Yeah, the U.S. has certain laws when it comes to giving countries aid, military aid, laws that they have to abide by. And the U.S. government believes that the Israelis are not distributing as much aid as the U.S. and others believe should be getting into Gaza right now. Now, the Israeli military office that deals with Gaza has denied that it's halted the entry or coordination of aid in northern Gaza. But they have acknowledged shortfalls in the delivery of aid since the beginning of the conflict, but primarily blame Hamas and other criminal gangs for stealing aid for many of the problems. This is still a pretty big deal, though, that they've gone ahead here and put this letter out, coming from the defense secretary, coming from the Secretary of State here in the U.S., very specific criteria of what they want to see, including ensuring the entry of at least 350 trucks a day into Gaza, putting in place humanitarian pauses to enable aid delivery, lifting evacuation orders, a whole bunch of orders here from the U.S. government. And it emerged just hours after the Pentagon confirmed the arrival of U.S. troops in the region. So you don't quite see a quid pro quo here, but there might be a quid pro quo, being like the U.S. government saying, the Biden administration saying, listen, we're going to back you up on Iran. We're sending those new THAAD missile, that THAAD missile system we told you about on the podcast on Monday, this terminal high altitude missile defense system, our newest technology. U.S. troops are now on the ground there to operate that. So Israel, can you do this for us in terms of aid? And so, we're going to watch this back and forth here, Jill, because the big concern for Biden, for Harris, everyone's watching right now is what happens in the Middle East in the coming weeks, and will it potentially impact here the election?
Right. And those troops, part of the U.S. helping to back up Israel in the case that Iran retaliates from Israel's expected counterstrike on the country. Also from the Washington Post, Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have assured the United States that a counterstrike on Iran will be limited to military targets rather than oil or nuclear facilities. This is according to sources that spoke to the Post. President Biden has conveyed in public that he is opposed to striking Tehran's nuclear and oil facilities. And he did discuss Israel's plans with Netanyahu during a classified phone call last week. Classified, yet we seem to know exactly what they talked about, Moshe.
Yeah, Jill. As we found out in the last year, a lot of leaking going on from these classified conversations to the media.
So in that conversation, Netanyahu relayed to Biden his plan to hit military targets. Responding to the Post's report, though, Netanyahu's office said that it will consider U.S. opinions, but ultimately make this decision to how to respond to Iran's October 1st attack based on its own national interests. And then the AP says that two senior U.S. officials have said that Netanyahu's promise not to attack nuclear or oil facilities is not absolute and that circumstances may change. So Israel, they say, could target missile and drone storage sites, military bases, key government buildings, and nuclear research labs. That is according to two Israeli officials who spoke to the New York Times. I think the translation here is like, everything's still on the table, potentially.
Everything's on the table. Some things are sort of off the table. There's certain things that the Biden administration wants off the table, like, hey, Israel. So you assassinated a couple terror leaders. We're cool with it, but like we don't love it right now because like it's not stabilizing the region. Iran responded with their missiles. Now, because of the number of missiles Iran sent, you have to strike back. So when you strike back, can you just like take it easy? So you don't then have them strike back even bigger, which because of the way things could go, will eventually involve us here in the U.S. And the U.S. military that's stationed there in the region. So you have the Israelis saying we're not going to hit the nuclear sites and oil sites because like that would make oil prices go high, and like the nuclear sites could just unleash a new level of hell on the region. But the Israelis also don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but they want to hit the nuclear sites where they're developing the nuclear weapons before they have weapons, because once they have weapons, then you're talking about two nuclear armed countries, the Israelis and the Iranians. So there's just multiple levels of chess happening here. And so there's a lot of concern from Biden, like, hey, can you guys just take it easy for 3 weeks? We have an election coming up here. And like, I don't need this. And I've been good to you guys. And the Israelis are like, yeah, you have been good to us. So maybe we won't do that, but maybe we will do that. And so it's a very complex web of things. Things are being leaked. Are they being leaked strategically? Are they actually what happened in the conversation? We know how the two sides feel about each other. We talked about the Bob Woodward book last week. Biden uses obscenities to describe Netanyahu. Netanyahu uses obscenities to describe Biden. Trump calls Netanyahu all the time. So they're having their own conversations. So there's might be bets being made by Netanyahu on Trump there. So just a very complex situation, Jill. Again, less than 3 weeks away from the election. So that obviously factors into the calculus here for both the Israelis, the Iranians, and frankly, everyone else in the region.
All right, let's switch gears and talk a little business news from Market Snacks. Right-sizing the big gulp. 7-Eleven parent company 7 & I is closing 444 underperforming stores across North America, blaming 6 straight months of falling sales, plunging cigarette purchases, and inflation. So that is about 3% of its more than 13,000 7-Elevens in the U.S. and Canada. It has been an eventful few months for 7-Eleven. 7 & I rejected a $39 billion takeover bid last month. To fend off the acquisition play, the company basically pitched investors on a plan to split into two businesses, and it wants to expand its fresh food offerings in the United States because apparently its 7-Elevens in Japan are hugely popular for their grocery-like spreads.
Jill, interesting they went with the number 444 because in Japanese culture, the number 4 is unlucky because in Japanese, it sounds like the word for death. So maybe they're sort of trying to make a statement there and trying to turn things around with a selection of that exact number of store closures there, just a aside as we look at this story. The big issue for 7-Eleven and a lot of convenience stores here in the U.S., they're struggling to win consistent customers. Sales are down. They're losing sales to Walmart, to Target. They're also, 7-Eleven is losing sales to Wawa and Sheetz. And so ultimately, you've seen Shell announce that it's selling off about 1,000 of its retail locations. Amazon has offloaded many of its Go convenience stores. 7-Eleven, of course, pioneered offerings, but Wawa and Buc-ee's have really taken things to the next level here. So we'll see how that world evolves. At the same time, Jill, another major brand here in the U.S. that's closing a whole bunch of stores. We got this announcement yesterday. Walgreens planning to close 1,200 stores over the next 3 years. His parent company made the announcement yesterday in an effort to in an effort by the struggling pharmacy giant to cut costs, change focus. So there are about 8,000 Walgreens in the U.S. 6,000 of the 8,000 are profitable. So, but they're going to close about 13. So they're going to close here about 1,200 of those 2,000 unprofitable stores. They reported a major operating loss over the summer. And so they're trying to right-size the ship over at Walgreens.
From CNN, fall is in full swing, but it is not too soon to look ahead to winter, especially one that could feel considerably different than last year's, which was dominated by El Nino. A weak La Niña climate pattern is expected to develop ahead of the season and influence temperatures, rain, and snow across the U.S. La Niña is a natural climate pattern that influences global weather marked by cooler than average ocean temperatures in the Pacific. Last winter was the warmest on record for the lower 48 states because it was dominated by La Niña's counterpart, El Nino. In a world also warming because of fossil fuel pollution, the prolonged warmth prevented many heavy snow events in the Northeast and Midwest and created a winter snow drought measured in feet of missing snow.
Jill, we should note, we do a couple years of La Nina, a couple years of El Nino, and then there are years in between, which naturally are called La Nada, the nothing.
Is that a joke or are you serious?
No, I'm telling you exactly, look it up. When it's not El Nino and not La Nina, sort of what we're in right now, we're in La Nada. So anyway, we see these weather patterns. They have an effect on us. La Nina not here yet, but it does have a likely chance of emerging here. And ultimately, no two La Ninas or El Ninos are the same, but they do have trends in common. What can you expect? We put up a map on this yesterday on the Instagram account. The northern tier of the U.S. can expect a wetter than normal winter, but it's expected to be warmer than usual. So wetter meaning rain, not snow. But for those of you in the Pacific Northwest, you might see more snow. Those of you in the Northeast, cross your fingers. If you ski in Vermont like me, that wetter than usual northern tier will be cold enough below 32 degrees for us to get some snow up there. But there's concern there might just be mainly rain.
And finally, from the BBC, Prague is ready to ban nighttime pub crawls organized by travel agencies, all in a bid to deter rowdy tourists from visiting and attracting more refined visitors instead. The Czech capital's authorities say that these organized pub crawls, often aimed at foreign bachelor or bachelorette parties, will be banned in the late night and early morning hours. The deputy mayor of Prague said that he wanted the city to become a place where, quote, refinement and respect for shared public space are a priority.
Yeah, so Prague's not alone here. We've seen this across Europe. Last year, Amsterdam launched a campaign to discourage British men from traveling to the Netherlands, saying, just don't come. Don't come here. They tried their best there in Prague. They have approved an amendment that limits organized movements of tourists from pub to pub that disrupt the night peace. The change was made on noise, safety, and cleanliness grounds. So crowds of drunk tourists negatively affect the reputation of the city, they believe. And so they're trying their best here. But we're seeing this in Spain. We're seeing this, in Amsterdam and some German cities, and now in Prague. So travel in very small groups, folks. If you go there for your stag party, as they say in Britain, or bachelor party or bachelorette party, subdivide into groups of 2 to 3.
So needless to say, they would not be fans, Moshe, of SantaCon.
SantaCon. I mean, I'm surprised New York has let that persist as long as it has. For those of you unfamiliar, we're literally talking about thousands of people dressed up as Santa walking around drunk in New York City every December. Did you ever partake, Jill?
No. You know what? No. I usually, this is like not my thing. No. I'm part of the refined tourists that Prague is looking for.
Jill could be the next tourism minister of Prague. All right, on this day in history, we begin in 1964. China, eager to join the nuclear race, detonates its first atom bomb on this day in 1964. Today, we still only have a handful of countries with declared nuclear weapons. That is the U.S., China, Russia, the U.K., France. Then you have North Korea, Pakistan, and India. Then you have a country with an asterisk, Israel, which doesn't admit to having nukes, but we all know they have them. And then the aforementioned earlier in this podcast, the Iranians are working on it. On this day in 1968, during an award ceremony for the 200-meter race at the Olympic Games in Mexico City, American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos give the famous Black Power salute. They were later ordered to leave the games after that. It was just months after the assassination of Martin Luther King. They wanted to protest racism in the U.S. Initially, they were met with boos. That Black Power salute. They were vilified by American media. They were called black-skinned stormtroopers by one of the broadcasters of the Olympic Games. The IOC expels them from the games. Eventually, though, we now look back at it as this sort of courageous statement, and it's interesting how that evolved over time. And we end here with a bit of music history. Jill, Songs in the Key of Life. That's my selection as one of the best albums in history. Stevie Wonder's LP there. Hit number 1 on this day in 1976. Isn't She Lovely? Sir Duke. Always. It's a great mix of music there from Stevie.
All right, I don't disagree with you, Moshe. I weirdly was thinking you were going to talk about maybe a Michael Jackson double album, because I feel like he used to put out those double CDs.
He had a couple, yeah.
But Stevie Wonder, can't complain about that.
And we end here with, it's Dolly week here, Dolly Parton week here on the podcast. On this day in 1982, her version of I Will Always Love You attained commercial success, reaching number 1 on the Billboard charts. It actually reached number 1 back in 74 and then reached number 1 again in 82. And so with that achievement, hitting number 1 both times, she became the first artist to ever achieve hitting number 1 twice with the same song. And then, of course, Whitney Houston would do her version of it just a few years later.
Dare I ask which version you prefer, Moshe?
It's Dolly week here on the podcast, Jill, but her version solid, is great, you could even say. But I mean, Whitney, it's iconic. I mean, can you really argue with the way, how can you argue that Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You, it brings chills, gives you chills, no?
I feel like that was just kind of a test.
Yeah. I mean, you got to be a Dolly Parton fanatic to argue that she has the better version. I think Dolly would even say, "Yeah, no, Whitney crushed that song."
I think she has said it actually.
Yeah, she's like, listen, it's Whitney Houston. It's one of a kind.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
See you guys.